had my first experience of taking supplements when I was 17. And it turns out that product had an analog of methamphetamine. So it was unregulated meth sold to teenagers. I thought that was pretty insane.
Supplements are one of the most debated topics in health and performance. Do they work, and which ones are worth taking? How can you be sure what's on the label is actually in the product? For today's guest, these questions are both a personal obsession and the inspiration behind his business.
There's an overwhelming perspective from the medical field generally of that supplements don't work. I have a controversial opinion. I think supplements in many cases are a much better methodology for reaching better performance outcomes than whole food.
Theo Wiley is the founder of Myoform, a company that combines DNA, lifestyle, and health data to create personalized performance supplements.
Taking something off the shelf just didn't really make much sense to me. You have 140 kilo rugby props taking the same thing as a 48 kilo female ultramarathoner, and you're walking into Holland & Barrett's and buying the same product off the shelf.
In this episode of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast, we ask some pretty big questions. Could your DNA reveal the nutrients, training strategies, and recovery methods best suited to your biology? Why do some people see remarkable results while others see nothing at all? And what happens when AI starts making health decisions alongside us? Hi, Theo. Welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. The sun's out in the UK, so the moods are lifted. You can tell around the city, right? So I'm happy.
That's good. Yeah, I'm happy too. It's always my favorite time of year after a long, wet, wintry period. It's nice to see some daffodils and the sunshine, and so that's exactly awesome. Can we start by passing it straight over to you and for you to introduce yourself? Tell us about who you are, and really let the listeners know why we're interviewing you today on the podcast.
Yeah, no, and thank you very much for having me. So I guess the first port of call is we know each other from a long way back. For the listeners that probably aren't aware, Martin was at the University of Exeter, as I was as a student, and Martin was the leader of my favorite module, being research methods. Hence the connection. But
no one's favorite module. That's no one's favorite module. Statistics and research methods was the bane of my existence for a number of years. But anyway, carry on, Theo.
Me too, as a student, for sure. So it's a bit of a full circle moment, at least on that front. But my background, so coming from the University of Exeter, I was studying human biosciences. And then I've spent the last sort of 10 years in the biotech and pharmaceutical industry, particularly in precision medicine, working with gene therapy manufacturers, everyone from large pharma down to smaller mid-sized biotechs, kind of at the cutting edge of clinical research, treating rare, ultra-rare conditions, neurodegeneration, ALS, Parkinson's, etc., Alzheimer's. I'm really bullish about that world and some of the research that's coming out in that space over the next 10 years. There's going to be some, I think, pretty exciting changes about the way that we see disease in those extreme circumstances, in terms of having lots of specific subtypes of conditions, and then also kind of curative therapies too in that world. Kind of going a long way back as well. I grew up with a form of hearing loss that deteriorated over the course of my childhood and into my teens. Around the age of sort of 12, 13, I lost all of the hearing in my right ear. And that kind of came along with a ton of extreme vertigo. So I spent about a year at different phases of my life, sort of largely unable to function as a normal human being, kind of not being able to get out of bed and so on and so forth. So I spent a lot of time in the health system, bouncing around the NHS for quite some time, as did my parents. Pretty scary experience, and grew an affinity for understanding health and disease, certainly in the context of my own, and always been very much interested in human performance, just never nearly talented enough to do anything with my own sort of physical performance. So I played a lot of sports growing up. And I had my first experience of I'm sure we'll touch on this a little bit further, but taking supplements when I was 17, and that product was a pre-workout product that was, full of stimulants. And I will say it was one of the more wild experiences from a supplementation standpoint. But it turns out, after I started taking it for a few weeks, started to get heart palpitations, anxiety, and sort of intense sweating. And I come to learn after a few weeks, a few athletes started to get popped for consumption of banned substances, and it turns out that product was the source and had an analog of methamphetamine. So it was unregulated meth sold to teenagers, hidden behind a proprietary label, or proprietary blend, or it wasn't disclosed on the label. I thought that was pretty insane. So kind of that's the red thread that's kind of gone through both career and then personal life, interested in improving performance, running marathons and being in the gym, and trying to figure out how do I improve performance. That kind of led me to the path of what I do now, which is Myoform. So it's a company whereby we try and apply those same principles of precision medicine, but to consumer health. So we take a lot of the technologies that are being applied, like genetic sequencing, blood serum biomarker testing, even kind of wearable integration, into account and develop personalized solutions. And right now that takes the form of supplements, performance supplements, and I'm sure we'll touch on a lot of that today. But that's sort of a long story short about who I am, what I do, and why we're talking.
That's a good whistle stop tour of your career to date. So thanks for that, Theo. It's always good to reconnect with my former students. So when we did reconnect relatively recently, it was really nice to see how well you've done in your career. Nothing to do with my research methods module. I'm pretty sure.
Well,
despite my teaching, you've done very, very well. Yeah, that's awesome. So Myoform, interesting company. I know when I first saw it and saw what you were doing, it's this kind of, the way I saw it, it seems like you're at the intersection of a few different areas. You are looking at genomics, you are looking at performance, you are looking at supplementation and nutrition. When you brought those areas together and formed this idea of the company, what problem were you trying to fix, or what was the situation across those different fields that made you think there's a business here, or there's a need for us to do something that doesn't currently exist?
Yeah, I think selfishly, and this is probably part of the reason why I studied human biosciences in the first place and then dove into the world of genetics, is I wanted to figure out what I could do to improve my personal performance. And I would have loved to be, as most kids did at the time, a professional athlete in some capacity. Played a lot of rugby, a lot of football, and that obviously led me down that path of taking supplements and things. But I first kind of dove into the world of genetics as a result of trying to figure out, hey, are there some traits that I have that I could leverage if I can understand them well enough, that could lead me down a path of, hey, I might be really good in this capacity versus somewhere else. And so kind of the passion really started out of genetics, and obviously as my own sort of health experience happened from a hearing perspective, that had some genetic underpinnings, and so that was my kind of first exposure to that world. So I ran a lot of kind of these direct consumer testing processes myself, whether those are genetics or blood biomarkers. And the thing that kind of frustrated me with the results that I would get was that they were interesting, but they didn't have much carryover into the context of my life, right? You would get a genetic report that says, hey, you have one gene or SNP that is under or overrepresented in athletes for power athletes. And I always thought, well, if I'm an endurance athlete, why do I care if my power genes are particularly great? Like, why does that matter in the context of my life? And the same applies for blood testing. Why does my vitamin D score being low, or my serum vitamin D being low, matter in the context of my life performance and things like that? So Myoform was at least initially a self-experimentation process where I ran my full genome testing, combined a few other data sets, and then thought, if I can combine these things together, will they help me improve my performance in my marathon time, in my 5K, and my cognitive performance at work and things like that? So and as I mentioned already, taking something off the shelf just didn't really make much sense to me. You have 140 kilo rugby props at university taking the same thing as a 48 kilo female ultra marathoner, and you're walking into Holland and Barrett's or GNC or wherever you get your supplements and buying the same product off the shelf. From a scientific perspective, we know that there's very different metabolic demands based on lifestyle, but also just biometrics. If you're a female, there's different considerations than a male, and your age has a significant impact in a variety of processes. It was a question of, one, can we use data to inform what we do and take? And then the second piece was, how much of an impact does that have from an outcome perspective when those things are managed? So that was kind of where it was born out, and it kind of snowballed from there. A few other people, as I started doing it myself, were interested, and we kind of built this system, and it kind of grew into there seems to be a business and want and need here. And I think over the last 2, 3, 4 years, where you've seen the explosion of direct to consumer testing and bloods and others, that there's serious demand for understanding health, longevity, and performance. So I think we're in the right stage right now. I think there's a good balance of enough data to create directionality, and it's only going to get better from here.
I've definitely observed an increased appetite for more science, for more evidence. There was a project that I've been involved in within defense research. There was something called human augmentation. It's something you can read about this online. It's openly available. But it's this idea that human performance is the things that we do to take people up to their level of biological potential. So getting good sleep, good nutrition, good training, almost wringing the sponge dry of all these different things, getting everything out of the person. And then it becomes a point where you can exceed biological potential with technology, and we can use certain pharmaceuticals. Maybe there's certainly certain technologies. Exoskeletons is an example. Almost X-Men, Marvel Universe sort of territory. But one area that's growing, and I think is a popular concept, is this idea of personalized medicine, personalized nutrition, making the intervention personal and changing bits and pieces so it works for the individual. What does that really look like in practice? So when you're moving from population-based data into an individual level decision about what to take or what not to take, what dosage, all those things?
Coming from sort of the more clinical side, there's a concept called P4 medicine now that kind of takes into account exactly what you're talking about. It sort of needs to be a system and set of processes that are predictive. They're focused on performance. They're preventative. And I forget what the fourth one is, but ultimately that's kind of the intention behind what we do. But I perhaps certainly when it comes to supplementation, there's an overwhelming perspective from the medical field generally. I think you speak to most physicians, and there's a perspective that supplements don't work flat out. But I think supplements as a category is so broad, right? It's not just vitamin A and B, C. It's a range of molecules, and there's a gray area between pharmaceuticals and supplements in many cases. It just so happens that that's what we create a determination, and one sits either side of that line, but it's not a clear line. It's quite fuzzy in that sense. So I have a controversial opinion that I'm sure it's similar in that sort of human augmentation standpoint, in that
I love a controversy, Theo.
Give me this. I don't know how controversial it is these days, but ultimately I think supplements in many cases, much like pharmaceuticals, are a much better methodology for reaching better performance outcomes than whole food. Because in order to get your daily intake of creatine, for instance, let's say we're considering 5 grams as the generally agreed amount that's a daily dose for creatine, you're going to have to eat a significant amount of additional nutrients, whether those are calories, saturated fat, if you're trying to capture that from red meat. It's just an ineffective way of getting those nutrients into your system. And they might come with different sort of cofactors and things that help enhance absorption. But if we're thinking about controlling for variables, having the pure ingredient that we know crosses a blood-brain barrier or is absorbed appropriately, then it's going to have it's a more controllable and clearer way of getting certain nutrients into the cell. So creatine is a great example of that, and there's hundreds of others. And then when it comes to something like, let's use a less sexy idea of B vitamins, we know that there's specific genetic variants involved in specifically in relation to MTHFR. So the MTHFR gene, which encodes for methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase, which is an enzyme that's involved
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, exactly. I don't often get it right the first time. But certain variants in that gene result in an enzyme that functions considerably worse than healthy, quote unquote, healthy versions. There's sort of three distinct variants. One is what we call normal. One variant results in roughly a 30% decline in the function of that enzyme, and then another results in a 70% decline in the function of that enzyme. And so for someone that's consuming B vitamins, one, you're going to have a much lower serum quantity of B vitamin, or worse off from an absorption standpoint, and B vitamins are involved in many different processes. And also, so you have an inability to break down that molecule as it comes into the system. And so by supplementing with a different form of a B vitamin, so a methylfolate or methylcobalamin, so B9 and B12 derivatives, you skip that step by which that enzyme is involved in the metabolism of that specific molecule. So we see consistently lower serum levels of B12 and B9 and other molecules in individuals that have that genetic variant. And of course, lifestyle and environmental factors play an impact or play a role, but having that understanding allows us to control for that variable, so that when we do supplement moving forwards, then there's the outcome that we desire can be achieved, right? And I think that's the other piece, right? There's sort of, when we talk about supplementation specifically, I always talk about 4 specific things that are important in order for the supplements to be effective. So it's not just a yes or no, do supplements work? It's what is the outcome we're trying to achieve first is the most important thing, because that then impacts what are the ingredients that we select for that are then clinically indicated in improving performance in a specific domain, or indicated in raising serum levels or nutrient status for a specific case. And then we have sort of the dosage of those ingredients in terms of dosage that is going to be clinically effective. And then you also have compliance, because most of these things aren't acute in nature. They require consistent consumption. And so if you don't have any of those 4 things, or one of those 4 things is out of whack, then ultimately they're not going to have an impact. And I think most of us, or at least general consumers, don't necessarily have familiarity with that. We tend to take things quite blind because we've heard an influencer say something that has very different biology and different objectives. So if you're doing a marathon, or if you're just trying to have better cognitive performance at work, those things are going to have very different determinations on what products you should be using versus others. So there's a ton of data about whether or not it's a specific molecule having the impact in order to raise you back to not being deficient, right? Versus taking an ingredient to augment performance or go beyond what would otherwise be possible. And those ingredients tend to be quite different.
I think I'm guilty of being that person that says supplements don't work. I've definitely been that person. I definitely have. And I think I was saying that, not understanding what you've just said, that I think my observation is a lot of supplements haven't worked for certain people because they're missing some of the factors that you just discussed then. So, it depends, isn't it? It's like whether supplement A works, there is a definite gray area of it depends. It depends on certain things. I know one of the hot topics that I hear of quite a bit, and I guess it falls into maybe the environment. You kind of mentioned that there's those environmental factors, and it's the microbiome that there's all this talk about the gut microbiota or the virome, even, like not just those bacteria. It could be viruses and phages and what have you that are involved in the gut. Does that fit in somewhere? Is that something that is, can we address that now, or is that more sort of science fiction? Maybe in the future might combine with genomics. What are your thoughts around those sorts of things?
Yeah, the microbiome is something we've looked at quite extensively because us as a business, or our focus is predominantly in performance. How do we improve performance as opposed to just health and longevity? Because I think that's covered off by a lot of things, and I think it's, to me at least, less exciting than how do we augment performance. But the microbiome in the context of health, it's very clear that the link is there in that generally diversity is a positive thing. The more gut flora diversity you have, and there's specific gut flora, obviously there's millions of bacteria involved in that. I'm certainly not an expert on all of that, but what it appears from a health perspective, generally focusing on diversity is a positive thing. For performance, I almost would perhaps liken it to avoiding deficiency in nutrients by focusing on general diversity is equivalent to avoiding deficiency, right? You're not necessarily going to augment performance in that going beyond a ceiling, but you might be able to get to a baseline that might be better than your general kind of existence. But it's right now it's from a performance standpoint, the data seems to be pointing towards different population densities can impact specific performance outcomes. So I'll give you an example. There's I forget the name and I'll butcher it, but there's a specific flora that's involved in the metabolism of lactic acid that seems to be overrepresented in athletes that are focused more in endurance or sort of high VO2 sort of max focused training, whether that's CrossFit and others like that. There's a chap called Chad Kirkzik at Lindenwood University who ran it was albeit an N of 1 study, but focused on a specific CrossFit athlete before and after in the run up to the CrossFit Games, during and then after. And there was a very interesting change in the distribution of flora based on as training volumes changed. There was a positive adaptation in the gut that conferred a performance advantage. And it seems to be that way in many other sort of use cases. And as I say, I'm certainly not an expert in this, but it would appear that attempting to drive I guess there's a chicken and egg situation here, right? Is it the training that's driving those changes, or is it something that they're doing? Can you change that in the absence of that stimulus from the training? But from my senses at the moment, there's still a lot of research to be done in the performance capacity, but getting your gut microbiome healthy is going to make or at least more diverse, is going to make an impact in most people's health, because not all of us have a particularly great diet. It's tough to keep it consistent and get enough fiber in and so on and so forth. So that's what we suggest at this point. We don't run microbiome testing right now because of the fact that it's just so complex and the data's a little bit messy right now. But I think certainly with AI and machine learning, the amount of data you've got to go through, because you're looking at millions and millions of sort of individual bacteria, it will
layer in the billions of viruses as well. It's
it's too tough to, I think, deconstruct right now, but over the next 5 years, I think we'll definitely have that, and it's linked to the genome and other health outcomes too.
Yeah, for sure. So talk us through what Myoform actually does, or similar products or similar companies. Like, what's the process in simple terms? Like, what do you collect? How do you analyze it? How do you translate that into something that somebody then can use?
Yeah. So we typically take a salivary sample on the front end to gather kind of genome data. So we run whole genome testing, and the difference between what we do and let's say 23andMe or Ancestry.com, we run what's called whole genome sequencing, which looks at 100% of your genetic information. Typical consumer genetic testing companies tend to use a smaller assay, which looks at roughly 0.03% or less than 0.1% of your genetic material, and for good reason, both on cost and from a data perspective. It's expensive to manage, and we don't necessarily know everything about the genome that there is to know yet. those companies for their use cases have focused on using smaller panels in order to, for the utility of what they're trying to get out of the data. The challenge is, as an individual, you still don't have utility of that data beyond the use case for what they're providing. So as a point of principle, we run whole genome sequencing because, one, it's now cheap enough to do so. Comparative pricing between doing a small assay versus a whole genome, like it's similar enough that it doesn't make sense to do a small panel anymore, at least from my perspective. And we then process that data. We get roughly sort of 80 gigabytes worth of data per individual, which is a huge amount of information to manage. But again, we don't necessarily know what to do with 99% of that data at this point. But the idea is that over the course of the next 4 years, the current data set that we know that connects the genome to sports outcomes, performance outcomes, injury risks, tissue-specific injury risks specifically, and nutritional markers, that quantity of data in terms of the number of papers that are published is due to double over the next 4 years. And so there's only going to be an increasing amount of data out there, and we're going to get better and better at processing that data. So for us, we want to be at the forefront, have all of that information so that we could share that with consumers over the course of their lives. Back in 2001, maybe to just set the scene, was the first time we sequenced the whole genome in the Whole Genome Project, which was
I remember it well. It blew my mind. It genuinely blows my mind that, I was at university at that point. I remember that was when I was doing my sports science degree. I remember the Human Genome Project, and it blows my mind how quickly we've got to this position where, like you say, you can sequence someone's genome relatively quickly, relatively easily. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, and I mean, at that time, it cost $1 billion to sequence the first genome, and to be honest, they actually only completed it back in 2018 officially, but they got most of the way there. But then the last sort of couple of percent points were much harder to do. But ultimately, it cost about $1 billion at that time, and now we can, Illumina and other companies are doing it for less than $200 at the kind of sequencing level, and then consumer and testing itself, like there's some margin built into that, but it's cheap enough now to get your genome done, and so it doesn't make sense to do these kind of small levels. But since 2001, over the course of the last 25 years, effectively, there's roughly been 20,000 papers released connecting the genome to nutrition, sports performance, and injury risks, and that's the kind of data set that we ingest for our platform. And as I say, that's growing at a rate of about sort of exponentially. It's about 12% per year, kind of compounded. And so, the way the nature of compound interest works, by 2030, there's going to be 40,000 papers and more and more and more. It's only going to get better. But we ingest that, and we develop read-specific markers that are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, which are small variants in the genetic code that impact the shape of the protein or resulting protein that is then kind of processed off the back of the DNA itself. And so, as I was talking about in relation to the MTHFR gene, a small change in those letters that make up the DNA can impact the way that resulting enzyme and protein is folded. And as most of us will remember from sort of high school days, if you as those proteins then fold, the lock and key mechanism in relation to the enzyme and the molecule that binds with it doesn't quite bind effectively and can result in some kind of adverse outcomes. So we look at multiple.
You're either ginger or you're not.
Exactly.
That's what happens.
Yeah. So ultimately, if we combine, it's rare that a single polymorphism, one of those SNPs, results like it predicts a specific outcome. And so what we do is we combine multiple genes in relation to the entire kind of metabolic chain of, let's say, vitamin D. We look at sort of 7 or 8 different genes that underpin storage, transport, absorption rate, and by combining those together, we create what's called a polygenic risk score, which is an indication of risk or predisposition that someone may have either a great processing power of a specific nutrient, or a perhaps worse processing power. And that informs then, from a directional standpoint, how we should supplement or adjust their nutrition in some capacity. But genetics isn't telling us what's happening today. In someone's, from a biological perspective, it gives us a question, a risk profile in a sense. The reason why we start with it is it kind of underpins everything else that happens, but epigenetics and lifestyle and all those kind of things impact what might actually be happening under the hood. But for most consumers, it's an easy, low friction, because it's saliva, way of getting directional. Most of us are buying stuff off the shelf and being told by someone at Holland & Barrett's or GNC who's had, 2 PowerPoint presentations worth of training on recommending existing products. For us, we want to get people directional in saying, hey, if you have a perhaps worse capacity for processing specific nutrient, let's focus on that and provide you with that molecule at a baseline level, and remove those other ones where it's likely you're going to be getting it in your diet already, and you are perfectly well off at processing that from what we can understand from your genetic profile. So that's the kind of starting point. And we also ask questionnaires, because genetics on its own really means nothing, right? It always needs to be kind of combined with some other data set. And so we ask a variety of questions around nutrition, lifestyle, biometrics, gender, age, because those are all things that also impact an individual's requirements for specific nutrients. And then for those that kind of want to ascend, we add in blood serum testing. But the reason we don't start with blood serum testing, as a question we kind of get all the time, is that, one, it's quite high friction in that you just, if you want to get either finger prick blood testing at home, now you have tasso collection devices on your upper arm, which are a little bit easier, but ultimately it gets a little bit messy when you have to do it on your own. And, the outcomes of those tests, certainly from a direct to consumer standpoint, they're very finicky, in the sense that you have to make sure you're fasted, you do it first thing in the morning. If you're well, we ultimately measure blood serum sort of quantities of specific molecules based on the total number of or milligrams or milliliters of specific nutrient, per unit of blood. And so if you're dehydrated, that can impact kind of ultimately what is shown. So there's a lot of variables that impact that. And then you also need to, it doesn't give you kind of a causative lens on why you might be deficient in some capacity. And then you have to do these kind of frequent tests in order to, get a really clear indication of how your interventions are having an effect, beyond the case of taking subjective feedback and things. So it's the reason why we don't start with it. And then also when it comes to blood serum testing, as I'm sure your background as well, looking at sleep, things like magnesium and even molecules like calcium aren't particularly reliable to measure at the blood level, because they are tightly regulated homeostatically by the body. Like most of the magnesium in our bodies and calcium in our bodies is stored in the bone and muscle tissue. And so serum concentrations aren't a great indication of actual nutrient status in an individual. And so by over relying on those kind of data sets, it's not particularly clear to understand if someone is deficient or subclinically deficient or not as well. So, and magnesium is one of those things that's touted a lot, and there's a lot of messy data around, does it have an impact, does it not, what form of magnesium? And there's it's the idea with Myoform is to take all of these data sets, do all the hard science for an individual, and then provide them with a product that we know for the most part is going to be covering 95% of their nutritional needs, plus specific functional ingredients that are going to help them achieve a specific outcome, like you're running a marathon, right?
I've got a colleague who's a nutritionist, and he might be listening to this episode. He's probably giggling his head off because I get asked about magnesium all the time, especially within sleep. And that's one of those ones where I have said before it doesn't work, but now I do recognize it. It depends. It does help some people in some situations, but yeah, I'm sure he's having a wry smile and a wry chuckle to himself as you brought it up, not me.
Yeah, I remember a conversation we had a while back. But to your point, like the data around magnesium seems to be, if you are clinically deficient, then it may have an impact. But in otherwise healthy individuals, supplementing with magnesium doesn't appear to have a really significant impact in improving sleep quality. What people tend to get confused with is the format of magnesium and things like threonate and glycinate and citrate, all the different kind of forms of magnesium. It's hard to disentangle. Like glycine on its own has an impact in sleep. And so whether it's the magnesium, the elemental magnesium itself that's causing the effect, or whether it's the glycinate or the glycine that's bound to it that's actually having the impact, it's not particularly clear. And so that's where the kind of confusion tends to come in the research is,
or even the placebo effect that someone just has heard a story that it was going to help them. And, it's a strong 100%. Effect at the end of the day. The placebo effect is a pretty strong effect.
Yeah, I saw a paper the other day, which I thought was fascinating, that was it was a research study in a group of sort of male weightlifters, or kind of recreational weightlifters, I believe it was, from a population standpoint. And they were all provided a placebo, but they were told it was injectable dianabol. So it's a form of a steroid, or testosterone derivative, very cheaply provided. And they, over the course of sort of 6 weeks, their bench press increased on average by 8.5 kilos. So just, the question of, do I believe I'm on steroids or not, massively impacted someone's performance, right? So
so the lesson to all S&C coaches: just lie to people.
Yeah, exactly.
That works just as well. Yeah. I joke, of course, don't do that. What about, you kind of mentioned biomarkers. Another topic that drives me to distraction, to be honest, is wearables. Like, I'm always asked about wearables. I mean, I wear various wearables. I'm happy to test them out, and I've got my opinion on some are good, some are not so good. Do you integrate any of that data into your system? Is it useful, or do you think that they're a bit of a gimmick?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways that at least I interpret it. Like, I'm one of those people that tries, and I've got 2 different rings on based on trying to see the difference between the two, because we do integrate wearables. So I've been sent a few things and tested. The way that we think about wearables is in the same, or the way that I think about wearables at least, is the same way as, using the same set of bathroom scales is important to measuring weight and and doing it at the same time of day and so on and so forth. I think they're useful from a directional standpoint, but not from an absolute standpoint. They're all using slightly different algorithms to determine sleep quality and HRV. I kind of have two different rings, and one tells me my HRV is 120 milliseconds, and the other one is sort of consistently around 40 or 50. And so, how you actually read into that is tough to know, and whether it's your right or left hand, it does vary. So it's the way that I think about it, and the way that we use it is to understand, is the product or interventions that are the sort of interventions that we're providing having an impact in a positive direction on your things like sleep and recovery and HRV and things like that. Because most of us, again, we take things blind. And so without the understanding or continuous feedback that things are having an impact, we're not really going to get anywhere specifically. Most of us take things and say, hey, I kind of think I sleep a little bit better. But if we do have an objective measure to a certain extent, it will be imperfect. At least we can then, control for that and adapt based on the feedback. But what we use is also 7-day moving averages rather than single day changes, primarily because there's a lot of health anxiety, which I'm sure you've seen. People, I forget the term for this sort of insomnia as a result of
orthosomnia. Yeah, insomnia caused by the stress of worrying about your wearables. Orthosomnia, that is.
Yeah, I often check them if I have remembered to charge them. I forget these days. I check them the data sets at the end of the day, and so because sometimes when you wake up, right, and you've got a good score, but you didn't feel like you slept that badly. There's a positive impact in some cases psychologically, but when I wake up thinking I've slept good, and then I see a score that's bad, psychologically I'm like, oh yeah, I don't feel that good. Maybe this, maybe that. So we use 7-day moving averages just to track changes, but ultimately, they're not the be all and end all, but they're a useful data set that we consider to measure impact over time, rather than just self-reported feedback. Or if someone isn't using blood testing, which again, as I said, is an imperfect way of measuring nutrient status and performance changes, but it is directional. So in the same way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess one of the things I see with wearables, and this is, I've the first wearable, I guess, or wrist based wearable that I bought or I've used was probably about 8 years ago, and I think in 8 years it's come on so rapidly that I'm always kind of optimistic that at this point in time they are useful. Like you say, you can see trends. You can get a direction of travel. I just see it improving. I see those wearables improving almost on a weekly, if not monthly basis. That technology is improving. So I think it's only a matter of time before the granularity of the data is there, and you I mean, there are medical wearables now, medical grade, and I think that technology will filter down into those consumer products, and we could use them.
100%.
I think the issue that I have with wearables is the overinterpretation of the data, that people can sometimes get the data in front of them and completely misunderstand what it is. Where does your system, how does your system deal with that? Is it possible, again, things like other available genetic tests, your 23s and me's and all that kind of thing. I've seen people sit down, show me the data, and completely overinterpret what they've been given.
Mm-hmm.
How do you avoid that? How do you stop people taking something that's in front of them and blowing it completely out of proportion, or just getting it wrong and leading them down a completely wrong path?
Yeah, well, there's also different sort of data or metrics that are provided on Whoop versus Aura versus Garmin. My Garmin tells me I'm the worst person ever, and then my Whoop is like, "Great, you're doing really well today."
Don't listen to him, Theo. You're not that
exactly.
You're not that
it's pretty brutal sometimes. But no, I think wearables, to your point, like there's massive utility to them, and it's only ever going to get better. In the same case as the amount of research that we have in genetics as well. Certainly, coming from a clinical trial background, the amount of data that companies like Aura are coming out with, where there was a recent amazing paper that followed, I believe it was 10,000 women, pregnant women, to terms, from conception to term, and they tracked their sort of vitals and data throughout that entire period, which is an amazing data set to be able to understand. And this is how science moves, right? You develop tools to measure specific molecules or outcomes, and we, as technology develops, we get better at having more sensitive tools and things like that. So I think oftentimes we, coming from the clinical trial background, we could have only ever dreamed of having depth of data, or keeping people compliant in a clinical trial is one of the biggest challenges associated with running research. And the fact that a consumer company can come in and get data on 10,000 pregnant women
people pay them for it too.
Exactly.
You have to pay the license fee to give your data away.
Yeah, and I think to an extent it's showing that, in a sense, consumer health used to be kind of taken the mick out of a little bit, maybe 5-10 years ago, where it was like, it's the data's not really there, etc. It's now becoming the cutting edge, the kind of drivers of clinical research, and it's great that everyone's publishing, because otherwise we can't get access to that massive data. I'm super positive about wearables generally, but how we kind of interpret it is, to your point, there's so much information. You go on your app and you can see 10,000 different metrics, and it's a bit overwhelming. What we do is, because we're not a wearables provider, we ingest different data from different providers, like basically the top sort of 7 to 10 wearables companies. We've created our own metrics that factor in a normalized data set. So we kind of have we have 5 main metrics that we report back on, things like sleep, recovery, readiness, and a couple of others, in order to not overwhelm people. We don't see our platform specifically as the place where you're interacting on a daily basis. You want to come back in and kind of get a general feel of where you're moving directionally, but how they interface with us on a daily basis is through a physical product, through our kind of supplementation and training programming and things like that too. Yeah, it's and as I say, we focus on those kind of 7-day moving averages as well. So we don't allow people to explore that much beyond that, because I'm like, if you want to go do that, you can do that through those providers. We're just ingesting and normalizing that data and combining it with the genetics piece and combining it with a few others. And what's quite cool, as I kind of had mentioned earlier, with respect to genetics, it's not just nutritional. We can also look at physical traits. So things that we can't otherwise get from blood, serum, or others is, what is your VO2 max trainability? As we know, roughly kind of there's a 50% heritability when it comes to VO2 max. And some people just, you cannot, or they're incredibly resistant to sort of aerobic trainability in a sense, or VO2 max.
That's my excuse as well.
Exactly.
It's got nothing to do with bone idle laziness. It's my genetics stopping me.
Exactly. But there's markers as they relate to kind of power, strength, endurance response, aerobic trainability. We can even look at tissue specific injury risks like lower back, ACL injury risk, and Achilles tendinopathies and things like that too. So we can look at cartilage modeling, genes, and things like that are represented or expressed in certain tissues, which is really exciting. We had a chap, there was a recent GB runner whose career was cut short as a result of continuous Achilles tendinopathies, and his risk score was one of the highest I've seen from an Achilles injury risk perspective. So there's interesting markers that we can look at that we then combine with like wearable data that we can then give indications of how should you load manage. If you're an athlete that has a lot of cutting movements, and you're playing on artificial turf regularly, whether you're a rugby player or footballer and things like that, you can load manage with the understanding that, hey, I've got a higher risk of ACL injury, so I'm going to improve or increase the amount of kind of rehabilitation work I'm doing. I'm going to avoid movements that are potentially risky for me, but I'm going to load manage to ensure that I'm not overtraining in those domains in order to kind of reduce the potential risk of those things happening. But it's not to say that just because you might be at high risk of something that you will have that outcome. But it's again, it's a direction of travel perspective to understand how should you manage your nutrition, your training, to with the understanding that you might not have the optimal genetics for that outcome. Like, I'm not a 7'4" Victor Wembanyama basketball player, and so understanding that is going to help me not maybe over exert in an area where I might have less of a chance, but focus on an area that I might have more of an opportunity in from a genetic standpoint. And that's always a controversial perspective, right? Of how much is it nature versus nurture, and can you overcome quote unquote sort of bad genetics in relation to certain things? And the answer is, I always say, yeah, absolutely, but it's just the nature of probability. Like, it's just going to be a lower chance or opportunity. You're going to have to work harder in some capacities. And if you have that understanding, then you can overrepresent your training in a specific area to overcome an area that someone else, I know we all know someone that can look at a dumbbell and put on 5 kilos of muscle. Like, that's just not going to be the case for others, right?
No, indeed it is not. It reminds me of a saying. So Preston Klein was on the podcast in series 1, and he talks about, the saying is, how long's the runway? There's certain things that you can get done, but some people, it just takes a long time. And if you've got a really long runway and you've got the time and the resource to train something, then you can. But a lot of the time, in a lot of high stakes environments or high stress environments, high performance environments, is you just don't have that amount of time. So you're having to select people with certain predispositions because you just don't have the capacity to train them. And I guess that kind of falls into what you're saying there. One of the things that I've seen as well is this confluence of psychology and nutrition. The idea of a nootropic. There's I couldn't even tell you what that means. I just see it all over the place at the moment. These nootropics or adaptogens is another phrase that makes me squirm a little bit when I hear it or read it. A lot of the stuff you've talked about so far seems to be a bit more physical. You talk about muscle, protein synthesis or VO2 max, or these more physical markers or physical aspects of performance. Are you seeing similar research around cognitive performance and how certain supplements can support, or maybe the absence of them can thwart, cognitive performance Or are you thinking it is a bit more of a physical performance? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think there's more and more data coming out in certainly the brain health side. The genetics as yet, it's I haven't seen a huge amount other than in things like sleep, specifically like sleep deprivation. I think you had someone on a recent episode where they were talking about genetics of certain individuals being resistant to sleep
Alison
deprivation.
Brager. Yep.
Exactly, and there's some interesting data around that, but there's also from a nutritional standpoint, creatine's all the rage right now, and there's some really exciting data coming out in creatine. And there was one specific paper which references a single megadose of creatine above 20 grams can reduce the cognitive decline or eliminate the cognitive decline associated with sleep deprivation of less than I think it's 6 hours.
Yeah, I'm aware
for
of that
several
stuff.
nights. So there's some really exciting data coming out on that front, and that's my jet lag hack these days is megadosing creatine for a couple of days after a long haul flight, and it doesn't stimulate you from a from a stimulant perspective, but it like a caffeine would, but it seems to clear the mind quite well. And then there's a range of different ingredients. Others that are kind of more fringe, peptide-y, piracetams and Nupept, and a few other ingredients that are of questionable efficacy. But obviously, there's also pharmaceuticals, pharmacological interventions like modafinil and others that seem to have impacts in reducing um, the effects of sleep deprivation. But then from cognitive perspective, I think caffeine is a very interesting one. We know that there's some pretty significant impacts in from a genetic standpoint when it relates to caffeine metabolism. My fiance, for instance, she has a sip of espresso and is buzzing for about 14 hours versus and can't sleep if she has a something after midday, whereas for me I'm 4 or 5 coffees deep by the end of the day and I can sleep like a baby. So, and that's largely mediated by a sort of enzyme that's responsible for the breakdown of caffeine, CYP1A2 gene, which sort of results in either a fast metabolizer or a slow metabolizer. And my fiance would be an example of a slow metabolizer being someone that can't effectively break down the molecule, and so it sort of tickles the adenosine receptors for longer. It roughly doubles the half-life of caffeine in those people versus others. And obviously caffeine is a very well studied molecule, not necessarily for enhancing cognitive performance, but for reducing decline, because it effectively staves off the feeling of tiredness. But there's also other, I think it's Adora A2A as a gene that's related to also the sensation or how caffeine is perceived when it's taken in. So roughly 25% of people have a sort of more anxious reaction to caffeine as well. So rather than it just being stimulating, it actively makes them feel sort of anxious. Understanding those things, you can control for those. But other molecules, there's some exciting research in functional kind of mushrooms and botanicals, ashwagandha in reducing kind of stress response. And as I say, from a mushroom perspective, we have done a little bit in that world, but there's not a massive amount of data yet that necessarily indicates that someone is going to massively improve cognitive performance. There's from a stimulation perspective, there seems to be effects, but whether or not that actually results in an improvement of outcomes from a cognitive performance perspective, it's not yet clear. But certainly from staving off decline, there's clear data from a number of ingredients.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think I agree with like I'm very skeptical, as you probably remember from days when I was at the university. I think that's to the prerogative of any researcher to have a healthy level of skepticism. But yeah, some of the consumer products around mental performance and these so-called active ingredients, these nootropics, these adaptogens, I'm skeptical about them at this point. Not to say they don't work, they might do. I just don't think there's sufficient evidence, at least that I've seen, that really convinces me yet. And I think there's a wealth of evidence, like you said, with caffeine. there's so much evidence around caffeine that I think it's hard to ignore. Similar with creatine, that there's a wealth of knowledge that's been produced over the years that certainly improves my confidence in that molecule or that product. Some of the other stuff, I'm a bit more reluctant to put my faith in it at this point, because I think there's just not quite the wealth of data yet. Let's say I could be wrong. I usually am on these things. Yeah. So someone will probably prove me wrong over time. But at this point, yeah, I'm finding it hard to believe some of the claims.
Yeah. Well, there's the argument about sensation and placebo too, right? If something feels it changes your state somewhat, there may be a performance gain that is sort of resultant from it that is positive in nature. There's a talk about the more physical side in this case, but beta alanine is an ingredient that's very well known and used in pre-workouts historically, and has great data behind it, but when it's loaded over a continuous period of time. But it's often added to pre-workout products which you aren't taking every day, and you kind of need to be taking every day in order to see its effects. But one of the side effects is a sensation that kind of causes skin prickles. I don't know if you've ever...
Yeah, the itches.
Yeah, the itches.
And people scratching and
exactly.
getting all itchy.
Because it increases blood flow to the... Yeah, exactly. It's and there's a case whereby, in the supplement industry, it's added to those things in subclinical levels in order to stimulate some kind of sensation. And so sometimes we confuse sensation with outcomes, but that sensation may also improve outcomes, right? It's hard to unpack that. So I agree with you. Right now, it's like and certainly this is the world of peptides too, but supplements was this, a few years back. There doesn't seem to be really clear, reliable data in many ingredients that indicate them in improving performance in a measurable way reliably. And it's kind of like the idea of, stepping over $100 bills to pick up pennies. And in some cases, those pennies might be inside a bear trap, right? Like, there's a safety issue in some cases with these molecules if you don't know what's in them. And when you're buying something off the shelf, like I had that experience where it's contaminated with a banned substance, there's always that risk when you're taking these things. So my general perspective, and this is kind of where Myoform was born out of, is make sure you're taking what we know you probably need from a biological needs perspective, but then those ingredients that have massive amounts of data behind them to achieve the outcome you want, like let's include those that have a massive scientific research behind them and sort of optimize in that direction, and then add additional ingredients on top of that where the data starts to come out, and it's better. And we can see from a measurement perspective when we're continuously testing consumers that it is having a kind of positive trajectory.
Yeah. How does it work? So I know with supplement companies, there are certain labs like Inform Sport and all this kind of stuff that are batch testing. They'll test a batch and say, yeah, it's clean, it's got this, and there's other companies which will say, it states that dose and we've checked it and it has got that dose and all that kind of stuff. How are you doing that when you are producing an individual sample? Like, the supplement stack that I'm going to take is unique to me because of this personalized approach. So how are you, what's the process there to ensure that it is what you say it is? How do you develop that trust with the consumer that they're getting what you say they're getting?
Yeah, so we thought about this a lot because we own our manufacturing process as a result, because we want to be able to control for all of those variables. So we own a site here in the UK, and we plan to open another one in the US. And because it's N of 1, to your point, we can't get batch testing from an Inform Sport or an NSF, because how they tend to work is you run 10,000 bottles of a specific ingredient. They take 3 off the line, one at the beginning, middle, and end, make sure that there's no contaminants or banned substances included. We can't do that because it's literally, we produce three bags of supplements at a time, and so we can't necessarily get the Inform Sport stamp of approval on every product. But there's a few things that we do. One is we, from a supply chain perspective, we purchase from products or suppliers that do have third-party testing or kind of COAs on each ingredient. both on banned substances and basically is the ingredient what it says it is. The second piece is we're working right now with the kind of parent company, or plan to work with the parent company of Informed Sport, which is called LGC, and they can do ultimately what's called informed manufacturer, where effectively we get the facility itself certified, because especially when we're working with professional athletes and things like that, that's super important.
Sure.
And we can, in some cases, if it's a necessity. Right now, obviously, we don't have that qualification, but that's why we focus a lot on the supply chain. But we can do individual testing on products. It's just somewhat cost prohibitive from a direct to consumer perspective, but for athletes and teams that might want that, we do layer that in. But ultimately it's a major issue in the industry, is bad quality ingredients and contaminants. Part of the reason for the contaminants is many of these ingredients are made in China. Also, the manufacturers are in China, and then the suppliers tend to be elsewhere. And they service different markets which have different regulatory infrastructures. So they might be producing kind of pro-hormones or peptides in the same vats that they're ultimately producing things that shouldn't have those ingredients in, and then you end up with these contaminants. So, and then there's some bad actors that might just be putting in extra things that might have an impact. Like Osterine is something that seems to pop up quite a lot in a lot of ingredients, and a lot of athletes seem to get popped for that, which is it's a not, I wouldn't say prehistoric, but it's a not particularly sophisticated anabolic steroid. So when it pops up in someone's sample from an athlete perspective, and this is almost always the molecule that does get people banned, it's really easy to test for. And so it's likely that if it does pop up in someone's sample, that it's probably from a contaminated ingredient versus someone trying to be sophisticated and beat the system. But
a dopey doper, I think, is what we used to call them.
Yeah.
People
exactly.
They're just a bit dopey. They didn't mean to do it. They're just a bit of an idiot.
Yeah. So and that's kind of, for us, for general consumers, like, other than the fact that you've got the kind of third-party accreditations, Informed Sport is and NSF are important in professional sports and things like that. But because general consumers are more interested in am I they're happy to buy stuff off the shelf regardless. So we try and make sure that all those things are covered off, but it will just be time before we can get those qualifications in place. But supply chain is the best way of controlling it and owning the process ourselves.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Theo, this has been a great chat. There's been some really cool insights, and it's great to see people succeed, and being able to see what you've been able to do since you were sat in those research methods lectures. It's awesome to see your progress, and I'm genuinely pleased about where you are and what you're doing. If people are interested in you, interested in your company, want to learn more about the things that you've talked about today, is there a place that they can connect with you or see things that you're doing? How do people reach you?
Yeah, so I'm on all kind of major platforms, Theo Wiley, whether that's LinkedIn, Instagram as well. Then from Myoform's perspective, myoform.io is our website. And we're currently live in the UK and US and many other markets as well. Those are just our kind of main two markets right now. And so, if you want to reach out, I'm more than happy to chat to anyone, and whether or not it's as a customer or otherwise, I'm always interested in the world of human performance. So that's probably the main areas. But I appreciate your time and having me on.
No worries. It's my pleasure. We'll get all those on the show notes so people can find those easy enough and click through and reach out to you. What we like to do on the podcast, as you may know if you've listened to some episodes before, is it's over to you to close up the episode for us. And so this is an opportunity for you to say something fresh, to reinforce a key message, whatever you want, really. It's down to you. So Theo, one more time, great episode, and really do appreciate your time. It's been really eye-opening to learn about what you're doing and to challenge some of my preconceptions. So I really appreciate what you're doing and the time that you've given to me and everyone listening. Over to you. How do you want to wrap this episode up?
I think I'll just finish it up by saying that I think there's a massive amount of value that can be gained by getting a clearer understanding about your health and biology today, no matter the level of evidence in some cases. I think it's the more you can get clarity on your biology, the more control you can have about the outcomes. And so by getting tested, understanding from a prevention standpoint, your health, those are always going to be more powerful than reactive, use cases of medicine or otherwise. So get tested, get clarity, and use that to your advantage. The tools are there. May as well use them.
Awesome. Great way to finish. Theo, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers.
Thanks to Theo Wiley for joining me today on the podcast. One of the things I found most interesting about this conversation is the idea that while we're all searching for better health, better recovery, and better performance, there can't be a single solution that works for everybody. As our understanding of genetics, of biomarkers, of human physiology continues to evolve, we're getting better and better at personalising nutrition. If you'd like to learn more about Theo and the work being done at Myoform, you'll find links in the show notes. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast and share it with somebody who might benefit from this conversation. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.